Hey, good morning. Welcome to Mars and the Two Cultures, a bridge not too far. That differs from what we saw in your program. A bridge not too far. We begin with two quotes. The first is from astronaut and astronomer Stan Love. Exploring is one of the best things people do. Explorations that aren't easy inspire us. We like it as people when people do things. If all you're after is science data, sure, send robots. But we as human beings feel an attachment when humans go and do things like this. And to this he's referring to as exploring Mars. The second quote is from physicist and novelist C.P. Snow. I believe the intellectual life of Western society is increasingly split into two polar groups. At one pole we have the literary intellectuals, at the other scientists, and as the most representative, physical scientists. Between the two, a gulf of mutual incomprehension, sometimes hostility and dislike, but most of all lack of understanding. There seems to be no place where the cultures meet. Despite their different contexts, including the more than 50 years separating them, the quotes from Love and Snow may be more interrelated than they first appear. In The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution, Snow demonstrates from the beginning that he is aware that neither of the two cultures is monolithic. Already in his 1959 lecture, he suggests further division into subcultures, such as when he writes of the attitudinal differences between pure scientists and engineers. Had he been with us this weekend, Snow might have seen other potential divisions into subcultures, for instance, between telescopic observers and on-site explorers, between robotic scientific exploration community and the human exploration community, between public sector space program folks and private sector space program folks, even between the electric propulsion community and the chemical propulsion community. Snow is careful to point out that attempts to divide anything into two, however, ought to be regarded with much suspicion, although he does go on to say that for the purposes of his lecture, two cultures is about right, and subtilizing any more would bring more disadvantages than it's worth. Yet, like much of the bridge building we've actually seen this weekend, Snow's goal in the two cultures is to emphasize traffic and the possibility of traffic, a bridge between the two cultures. It's also clear that Snow in 1959 had already begun to see and foresee the way in which both humanists and scientists would stand in the vanguard of efforts to address what he in 1959 calls the three menaces of H-bomb, war, overpopulation, the gap between rich and poor, to which we might add a fourth, global warming or climate change, as critic Gary Westphal does in his introduction to Science Fiction and the Two Cultures. Westphal also remarks on why it is that the genre of science fiction, which in its very name proclaims itself to be a meeting ground for persons devoted to science and persons devoted to the humanities, is never specifically mentioned by Snow in the Two Cultures. Westphal notes that in the late 1950s, someone like Snow would understandably feel that such a marginalized and debased form of literature, I write that stuff, okay, merited little attention and would be utterly incapable of playing any role in addressing a major societal division, unquote, from Gary Westphal. Snow overall, in fact, does not look to entertainments as the best way of bridging the two cultures divide, but to, quote, rethinking our education. He writes that although education isn't the total solution to this problem, nonetheless, without education, the West can't even begin to cope. Closing the gap between our cultures is a necessity in the most abstract intellectual sense, as well as in the most practical. When those two senses have grown apart, then no society is going to be able to think with wisdom. It's fairly clear in context that in that final line, Snow is also suggesting that not only when the abstract and the practical have grown apart, but also when the two cultures have grown apart, no society, quote, is going to be able to think with wisdom. To the extent that education can direct us toward wisdom, one way it might do so is through its constant reminding us of the necessity of balancing not only between the abstract and the practical, and between the humanities and the sciences, but also between the specialist and the generalist. In this context, we can learn a good deal from the Viking missions to Mars and their supposed failure to find conclusive evidence of life on the red planet. The biosignature's failure, no organics, no life, was not primarily technological or scientific per se. Instead, it has been argued the inconclusiveness of the Viking results arose significantly from the fact that we may have too narrowly defined the nature of the life to be discovered. At the time the Viking missions were conceptualized, we had either not yet discovered the welter of extremophiles found since in various extreme locales on Earth, from deep ocean hydrothermal vents to toxic gas caves, Antarctic ice, inside stone crusts, even inside nuclear reactor cooling pools, or we had deemed those extremophiles largely irrelevant to the Viking mission's search for life. This problem may have been exacerbated in the interpretation stage. Such conceptual myopia has been blamed by some for setting back Mars exploration nearly 20 years. It's also similarly risky to too narrowly define the intellectual life or practical relevant knowledge. The deep study of Mars, in fact what may be called a Martian or Mars analog curriculum, is particularly appropriate to rethinking our education. And I just wanted to reference the success of the Inspiration Mars Design Competition that we've already seen this weekend, which I think is a sort of example of this, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. It's valuable not only to discussing the place of STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, in the contemporary American curriculum, or even perhaps a wrong edit de-emphasizing of fiction in the current core curriculum. The deep study of Mars is also particularly appropriate to the broader ongoing balancing act between the sciences and humanities, the specialists and the generalists. And during the first half of this, I'm going to be laying the groundwork. Laurel is going to give a specific example of curriculum and a specific lesson plan, as it were, in her part of the presentation. We will return shortly to a discussion of the importance of the dynamic interaction between the evolving scientific understanding of Mars and the presentation of Mars in the arts, humanities, popular culture, and media. We'll also briefly examine how that popular understanding in turn sets the parameters for selling Mars, specifically the continuing discussion of the efficacy, expense, and likelihood of manned missions to Mars and eventual human colonization and civilization on the planet. First, however, a story that returns us to that quote from astronaut Stan Love. My wife and I have a small library of NOVA programs about Mars, including Ultimate Mars Challenge, Can We Make It to Mars? Is There Life on Mars? Welcome to Mars, and Mars Dead or Alive. When I look at the jacket copy for all those NOVA Mars DVDs, I'm reminded the statement from astronaut Stan Love that we as human beings feel an attachment when humans go and do things. They like to explore Mars. Even when, in this instance, on those programs, it's only our things, robots, that are present going and doing these things, exploring and experimenting. Consider the jacket copy from Can We Make It to Mars? Fraught with deadly meteoroids, perilous levels of radiation, streamlined spacesuits, gourmet space food. Or the copy for Is There Life on Mars? The planet's mysterious history, revelations from a planet once alien, provocative new clues in the tantalizing quest. Or the jacket copy for Welcome to Mars? Interplanetary adventure, white-knuckle landings, frustrating setbacks, elating discoveries, gripping drama, breathtaking images. Or the copy for Mars Dead or Alive, behind-the-scenes glimpses, compelling story of technical ingenuity, emotional drama, and triumph. Or the copy for Ultimate Mars Challenge, daring new landing technique, arsenal of one-of-a-kind science instruments, behind the scenes again, excitement again, mysteries always. Yet this is not just the language of hype. Rather, more profoundly, it is an attempt to humanize Mars exploration. As Love says, we like it as people when people do things. Even if in most of these Nova Chronicle cases, as we said, what people are doing involves doing by proxy through the robots we send, at least at this historical moment. As Cynthia Phillips, a senior research scientist at the SETI Institute, notes, if space exploration is only robots, you lose something, and you lose something really valuable. Humanizing Mars exploration is about empathy, sympathy, and relevance. It's also about story, analog, and metaphor. As Roger Launius, former chief historian for NASA and senior curator in spaceflight at the Smithsonian, in discussing popular responses to the Skylab space station, the shuttle and the International Space Station puts it, people who are not part of NASA or not part of the space community, maybe they're well informed, but they don't see practical applications in their daily lives. And they just have to scratch their heads and wonder, why are we doing this at the cost that we are? Launius is quite right to point this out. Although 70%, as we heard this weekend, 70% of Americans favor a space program. This percentage of Americans who favor sending astronauts to Mars has generally hovered around 50%. Proposed budgets for Mars exploration, year on year and in constant dollars, have been declining or flat for many years. Those who look to SpaceX for salvation must contend with the strong possibility that, as Brian Bernstein puts it in his article for Technology Review, even if such a private Mars exploration effort were able to invent and develop the needed technology, the logistics of Mars travel are so difficult that the cost would surely be too high to be covered solely by a new market in space tourism. In other words, it would demand the involvement of large institutions with financial and technical wherewithal, such as a space agency or coalition of several. And we're looking increasingly at that private-public connection. The problem therefore remains convincing the public that it is a worthwhile goal. The need for not only maintaining but growing the constituency for Mars exploration is something most in this audience are quite well aware of. Yet we are too ready to scapegoat bureaucrats who seem to control the public purse and ignore the reality that the public purse is ultimately controlled by public perception. Public perception is in turn shaped by a number of factors, including entertainment, education, political discourse in the broad sense. A great example of this was Friday night's discussion of the role of the Planetary Protection Office and the almost pathological fear of pathology among the populace, due in no small part to films, alas, like The Andromeda Strain, which was specifically referenced on Friday night. What we may have not emphasized enough is how much selling Mars has always involved metaphor, analogy, and story, the particular strong suit of the arts, humanities, popular culture, and media, sometimes for ill, often for good. The involvement of the humanities goes significantly beyond just the Latin and mythological place names for locations on Mars, or for rocket systems, or satellite systems named for classical astronomers. On July 20th, 1989, the 20th anniversary of the first moon landing, President George H.W. Bush put the American space program into perspective this way. Like Columbus, we dream of distant shores we've not yet seen. Why the moon? Why Mars? Because it is humanity's destiny to strive, to seek, to find. Nearly all of us recognize the historical context of Columbus's New World explorations at the end of the 15th century, but not all of us might be able to name the specific literary text alluded to in that last line, namely Alfred Lord Tennyson's 19th century poem Ulysses, the last full line of which reads, "To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." And part of this, I'm also in a sense responding and trying to address what Dr. Griffin said yesterday in a very interesting way, how it is we can reshape, as Dr. Griffin put it, our social self-concept to become strategically a true spacefaring nation. How do we do that? That's a huge project. Or consider the wonderfully Coles to New cashless fact that the Phoenix lander, a second incarnation of a previously failed mission, carried aboard it visions of Mars, a mini-disc that was itself a second incarnation of an earlier mini-disc library of Mars-themed media. The earlier vision of Mars mini-disc ended up at the bottom of the Pacific when Russia's Mars 96 spacecraft failed shortly after launch. That previous disc was updated, however, and the Planetary Society's Silica Glass DVD on Phoenix contains 84 Mars-related written texts, including Isaac Asimov's I'm in Marsport Without Hilda, and his novel The Martian Way, Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, Arthur C. Clarke's Transit of Earth and Descent of Mars, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, Alexei Tolstoy's Elita, Voltaire's Micromega, Kim Stanley Robinson's Green Mars, and an excerpt from Kurt Vonnegut's The Sirens of Titan. The minidisc also features 63 Mars-related works of art and 3 radio broadcasts, including the 1938 recreation of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and the 1940 discussion between H.G. Wells and Orson Welles, who directed the radio drama. So it is that we have broadcasts, artworks, interviews, and books on Mars, actually on Mars, on a disc library that is designed to last 500 years in Martian conditions. In reply to the Martian cannons that fired the cylindrical capsules that brought the Martian invaders to Earth in H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, we have returned fire by launching to Mars canonical Martian texts produced by humans. On the disc, Carl Sagan explains the rationale for the disc contents this way. Science and science fiction have done a kind of dance over the last century, particularly with respect to Mars. Just this weekend, by the way, I've heard several presenters remark how important Disney's 1957 film Mars and Beyond was to their developing a lifelong interest in Mars. Scientific interest in Mars, of course, goes back significantly earlier, may be said to begin in the 17th century with the work of Galileo, Tycho, Kepler, and Huygens. The apparently Earth-like nature of Mars, with its polar caps and sols like days, revealed by Cassini's work, led Bernard de Fontenelle in 1688 and William Herschel in 1784 to speculate on the possibility of life on Mars. In literary history, the case is similar. As early as the 18th century, both Swift in Gulliver's Travels and Voltaire in Micromegas had hypothesized the existence of 2 Martian moons, as yet undiscovered at the time of writing. The interaction between scientifically informed speculation and speculative imaginative presentation took an important turn, however, after Giovanni Schiaparelli in 1877 claimed to see on Mars a network of straight lines he called canali, or channels, and which Percival Lowell in 1892 popularized as canals, presumably engineered by intelligent life. From that point on, writers and filmmakers and other culture creators began to examine Mars as the solar system's other main abode of life. With each passing year, we have seen a growing intimacy in the long dance between the history of Mars in the sciences, as informed by advances in exploration, coming not only from telescopy, but more recently from flybys, orbiters, landers, and rovers, and the history of Mars in the humanities, from discussions of the naked eye understanding of the Horus of the Red One in ancient Egypt 4,000 years ago, and in associated later ancient and classical mythologies, all the way up to the most contemporary science fiction. As just one example of this later interaction, one need only look to the late 1970s, after the Viking landers had done their initial life search on Mars. In response to the Viking missions, the emphasis in Mars fact and fiction shifted toward the extremes, not only to the microbial extremes eventually, but also to the extreme maker of human beings from the cellular level on up to fit the Martian environment, as in Frederick Pohl's Man Plus and later Mars Plus, or the radical remaking of Mars to fit human beings, as in Robinson's terraforming novels Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars. It's not just in presidential speeches commemorating moon landings or on interplanetary time capsules containing canonical texts on Mars, however, that humanity's destiny is also tied up with the destinies of the humanities. I am reminded of a recent question and answer session involving Dr. John Callis, Mars Exploration Rover Project Manager for JPL. After his recent presentation, The Mars Exploration Rovers, A Decade of Exploration, that was at the LA Mars Society Mars Day 2014 event, I asked Dr. Callis what the current understanding was for how Mars lost so much of its atmosphere. He responded this way: we think that when the electromagnetic field around Mars collapsed, and into the remnants we see now, the solar wind blew away the Martian atmosphere like seeds from a dandelion. The simple, homely poetry of that statement seemed almost unconscious, yet it made clear to me how even those of us in the sciences shall never be rid of poetry in the humanities so long as we still have need of metaphors and analogies. The problem is that the poetry is too unconscious, that just as those devoted to the humanities are too often ignorant of the sciences, those who are devoted to the sciences too often possess, quote, nothing more than a formal touch of the cap, unquote, when it comes to familiarity with the traditional culture, as C.P. Snow puts it. Much as I love reading and writing science fiction, and as much as I do recognize its importance in addressing the two cultures gap, by itself it is not sufficient. One of our steps toward addressing that gap has involved developing an encyclopedia of Mars that deals all in one place with all aspects of Mars. This project will kill us, but we are working on it. All right. All aspects of Mars, no matter which side of the cultures divide, a given topic is usually seen as residing on. Yet, in calling for a Martian or Mars analog curriculum, our goal is not a reunification of the two cultures, or a situation in which one culture is subsumed into the other, but rather a broad and sturdy bridge suspended over the gulf between those cultures. A suspension that is built on a dynamic tension between the two cultures and which encourages traffic between them. The intent of such a curriculum is to provide one means to address the problem Snow identified in 1959. That unscientific flavor of traditional culture is often much more than we admit on the point of turning anti-scientific. The feelings of one pole become the anti-feelings of the other. If the scientists have the future in their bones, then the traditional culture responds by wishing the future did not exist. This polarization is sheer loss to us all, to us as people, and to our society. It is at the same time practical and intellectual and creative loss. As a result, both cultures are self-impoverished. Although I certainly agree that this self-impoverishment is a very bad thing, I think Snow perhaps purposely overestimates the polarization. It is only about as true to say that the traditional culture of the humanities wishes the future did not exist, as it is to say that scientists uniformly treat the past as a boneyard of quaint but outdated ideas fit only to be ignored. As human beings, we must not only have the future in our bones, but also recognize, as the humanists well do, that all of us have the bones in our future, that our mortality is a constraint we are all foolish to ignore. By presenting the here and now, as reflected from there, a distance of space, Mars for instance, and then a distance of time past in history or time future in science, both theories and stories, both the sciences and the humanities, present us with a way of renewing our vision. When on February 6, 2014, I saw the first shot of Earth and Moon in the Martian sky, taken by Curiosity rover's mass cam, 80 minutes after sunset on January 31st, 2014, Sol 529 of that mission, the first thing that came into my mind was this sentence: standing on Mars, staring up at the stars, one can be forgiven thinking Earth's a piece of heaven. I had seen other pale blue dot photos, including a shot from the Spirit rover 10 years earlier, but none of them affected me quite like that. Looking at Earth literally through the lens of a human construct on Mars crystallized for me the importance of looking at Earth in terms of Mars. Already, expeditions to Mars analog sites on Earth, to the Mars Desert Research Station, MDRS, in Utah, Flashline Station, FMARS, at Hutton Crater in the Canadian Arctic, Mars Oz and Arkarula in Australia, have, as simulated colonies, in many ways brought Mars to Earth, rather than Earth to Mars. Looking at Earth in terms of Mars has already broadened our understanding of the diversity of life on Earth. By encouraging the setting up of microbial observatories in Earth environments that may be in at least one way or another, like certain environments on Mars, we have learned a great deal about the extremes to which life has gone on Earth. Going to Mars won't solve all our human problems. Going and being on Mars won't solve all our human problems. To paraphrase Buckaroo Banzai, wherever human beings go, there human beings are. Yet it is also true that going places beyond what we've seen as a species takes us places beyond what we've been as a species. The Mars analog model of looking at Earth through the lens or mirror of the Martian end of the telescope deserves further extension. My response to the photos of Earth from the surface of Mars was essentially poetic. Although we recognize the potential of Mars exploration as a technology driver, we talk too little about its potential as a culture driver. We talk a lot about the human colonization of Mars, but perhaps a bit too little about the human civilization we wish to build on Mars. A civilization is more than just its technology, engineering, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That's the stem, but the flower is something else. The truths of the sciences make life knowable. The beauties of the arts make life livable, one could argue. Robert Zubrin has begun that cultural driver conversation, particularly in the epilogue to The Case for Mars. There he quotes historian Frederick Jackson Turner's statement about an ancient Greek frontier, what the Mediterranean Sea was to the Greeks, breaking the bonds of custom, offering new experiences, calling out new institutions and activities. But he doesn't stop there. Then Zubrin goes on to argue that the importance of the Greek frontier is analogous to the importance of other frontiers in progressive humanism, not only to the discovery of the New World and later the American frontier, but also to a much-needed Martian frontier. Yet we need to carry those analogies further into the humanities as well. If an appropriately human response to the accomplishments of science is wonder expressed in poetry, then, as in the Greek experience, the Martian Odyssey awaits its Homer, always remembering that Homer was probably more than one person. Zubrin also argues that on Mars, next slide please, education will be driven to a higher standard than ever seen on the home planet. A new standard may be set for a higher form of humanist civilization on Mars, and viewing it from afar, the citizens of Earth will rightly demand nothing less for themselves. Yet this idea, informed as it is by looking at Earth through the lens or mirror boomerang of Mars, is already part of what Mars has to teach us. We can already begin to formulate and formalize the Martian curriculum. Is there a need for such a curriculum? As Elizabeth Green writes in her July 23, 2014 New York Times article, "Why Do Americans Stink at Math?" across all school subjects, teachers receive a pale imitation of the preparation, support, and tools they need. And across all subjects, the neglect shows in students' work. In addition to misunderstanding math, American students also, on average, write weakly, read poorly, think unscientifically, and grasp history only superficially. Visions from Mars, from the Martian analog perspective, can help address all of those student issues at all educational levels. So, in the interest of helping teach the teachers, I have asked my co-presenter to examine not, as is more common, elements of the contemporary and near future exploration of Mars in light of the early modern age of exploration, but the reverse, elements of the early modern period in light of the contemporary and near future exploration of Mars. The context in our discussion here is shaped by three major transitions in our time that have clear analogs in the early modern period. The first is communicational, namely the transition from print culture to digital culture in our time, the early modern analog for which was the shift from manuscript culture to print culture beginning in the middle of the 15th century. The second is spatial, namely the transition in our time from viewing Earth as the only likely abode of life to an expanded view of the same that involves extraterrestrial worlds in our solar system, extrasolar or exoplanets beyond it, even a possible infinitude of worlds in a multiverse. The early modern analog for which was the discovery at the end of the 15th century of the terrestrial new world beyond the boundaries of the terrestrial old world, and the relevance of such discovery to the long debate about the plurality of worlds. The third transition is intellectual/methodological, namely the still largely unforeseen impact Mars settlement might have on the further evolution of the scientific method into something even beyond itself. The early modern analog for which transition is the shift from the old science of natural philosophy, with its older modes of inquiry, knowledge discourses, and knowledge systems, to the new science of experimental observation arising in the 17th century and characterized by the new modes of empiricism, materialism, and rationalism that inform the scientific method. Within such a starting with Mars context, we consider it a hypothetical undergraduate course, a course in the speculative literature of discovery. Laurel will be discussing the issue in such a course of a specific proto-scientific fictional text, Margaret Cavendish's The Blazing World, published in 1666. Laurel? And you can. We're told that this machine is genderist because it clipped to a belt. She doesn't have a belt. Okay, so she's moving her microphone. You sure you can use it?
Can you hear me?
You could probably put it in a pocket, sweater pocket.
I'm okay.
You could put it on the table.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do that. Just put it to yourself.
Is that good? I'll try. I'm not used to being mic'd. So anyway, I'm going to sort of summarize the school part here to avoid having to just sort of read text. But what we're thinking about is a course that in my department, we have a topics course that is a senior seminar course, and faculty get to propose various topics depending on their expertise. And I envisioned a course in the speculative literature of discovery, which would start with contemporary Mars-based fiction and work its way back into the early modern period, which is my area of expertise. I mean, my training is a medievalist and Renaissance literary historian, so, you know, go with what you can, you know, with the tools you
Can
have.
you make the screen bigger?
No, I can't. I'm sorry. This is my technological impairment. But I can read the text that we were thinking about. The first component of the course would start with the present. And actually, before we would even get to these courses, we would start with Zubrin's The Case for Mars as a way of setting up the framework for the course. The text would basically allow us to get my students who are not very well trained in the sciences to get an understanding of the scientific framework for exploration of Mars, some of the cultural and social issues, the analogs between current Mars settlement, exploration, discovery, and all that, and analogs to what is more familiar to them somewhat, which would be discovery of the New World and those kinds of things. Then we would start with the works starting from most recently Jeffrey Landis's Mars Crossing, Benford's The Martian Race, Greg Baer's Moving Mars, Ben Bova's Mars, Brian Aldis's The Difficulties of Photographing Nix Olympica, the novella of Green Mars by Stan Robinson, and Philip K. Dick's We Can Remember It For You wholesale. And again, it's a lot of reading even for my majors, but this kind of thing can be sort of sussed out in terms of required readings and then assigning particular text to students to read and to report on and that kind of thing. So, next slide.
And most of our sources here are actually from, most of our canon are actually from the lander on the Martian library that went to Mars with the Phoenix lander.
Okay, then we would move back. Moving back from a set of texts that deal with everything from Viking and Mariner to the present, then going back in the 20th century, back to the late 19th century, to look at the literature that reflects a less precise, less scientific understanding of the actualities of what is there on Mars. Yeah, the canals, the romanticized, we basically project our civilization on Mars and the little green men and all the other good stuff. Starting with Lee Brackett's The Road to Sinharat, Asimov's The Martian Way, Clark's Sands of Mars, Bradbury's Martian Chronicles selections from that, Weinbaum's The Martian Odyssey, Stapleton's The Last and First Men, Tolstoy, not Leo, but Alexei Elita, Edgar Rice Burroughs' A Princess of Mars, War of the Worlds, of course, Service's Edison's Conquest of Mars, and Percy Gregg's Across the Zodiac. And then at that point we would leapfrog back into the mid-18th century, which is really sort of the very edge of what we would call the early modern period in a historical sense. And here we would start picking up some of the older texts that exist really before telescopy gave us even a clearer vision of what we could see on the Martian surface.
That's past the end.
Yeah, okay, anyway, but Voltaire's Micro-Méga, part of Gulliver's Travel, Book 3, where he lampoons the Royal Society on the flying island of Laputa, Fontenelle's Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds, Cavendish's description of the New World called the Blazing World, Cyrano de Bergerac's The Comical History of the States and Empires of the Moon, Wilkins' discovery of a world in the moon, Francis Godwin's The Man on the Moon, and Francis Bacon's The New Atlantis. So those would be sort of just a rough sketch of our curriculum. But in particular, I thought that I would take a few minutes to talk about how this kind of an analog curriculum would work with a text that is in the traditional literary canon a bit obscure, but more read these days, Margaret Cavendish's Blazing World, which is one of the constellation of works that represents the early modern cultural responses to the very drastically shifting scientific and intellectual landscape. Texts like these exist along what I would call an epistemological frontier, which marks the transition between old science and new science, and it really sort of marks a place where the two cultures just were beginning to start to part company. In the context of Margaret Cavendish's 17th century, the term science is really a dicey one. Natural philosophy, as it was thought of in the early modern era, is hardly to be considered a single coherent entity that we would recognize as science. Stephen Chapin, historian, puts it this way: Natural philosophy was a diverse array of cultural practices aimed at understanding, explaining, controlling the natural world. John Freely, in his book, Before Galileo, The Birth of Science in Medieval Europe, which, who would have thought, the outlines of the scientific revolution really are bracketed by the pioneering discoveries and observations and theories of Copernicus, Tycho, Kepler, and Galileo. And these discoveries led to a major intellectual upheaval, which continued through the 17th and on into the early years of the 18th century, during which time the worldview of Western Europeans changed dramatically. 17th century science, or to be precise, natural philosophy, was conceived by Newton, as by his ancient and medieval predecessors, to be an integral part of the larger philosophical exploration of the total reality that humans confront. I have a slide of the title page of the Principia here for you, just as a way of reminding us all that Newton did not call himself a scientist, he called himself a natural philosopher. And the title of the text, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, translates to the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. And this is how he titled his revolutionary work, laying out his laws of mechanics and his gravitational theory. New branches of natural philosophy, which popped up during the 17th century, included mechanism, a revival of atomism, vitalism, and experimental philosophy, which is probably the ancestor of what we would consider modern science. And these flourished along natural philosophy's more traditional subdisciplines, which included mathematics, geometry, astronomy, physics, optics, and natural history. So the journey of intellectual discovery during the 17th century led to major revolutions in the scientific worldview, and really a complete overthrow of what was the standard, the Aristotelian physical universe model, a system that had framed observational inquiry since the time of the ancient Greeks. And here is an example of your classic geocentric cosmos with really the Earth, the four elements at the center, and then coming out to the spheres of the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, which was really as far out as one could see with the naked eye. At the center sits the Earth, or more precisely, as I've said, the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water. The spheres from the Moon on down are imperfect, mutable, and subject to time. The supralunary spheres of the planets and stars are perfect, immutable, and eternal. Motion and causality are attributed to four Aristotelian causes: the material, formal, efficient, and final. Don't ask me to explain those, they're very obscure and weird. Aristotle's doctrines of natural motion and place explain the motions of the four elements. Each element strives towards its natural place. Dense earth naturally moves downward. Light and dynamic fire naturally moves upward, and water and air find their happy space someplace in between. The elements are joined in a dynamic of shared properties that complement and repel each other, and this would be heat, aridity, moisture, and cold. This is the Renaissance periodic table. This is how I introduce it to my students. My students have math anxiety and they're scared when they see a periodic chart, and so this is comforting to them. They're like, I am so there. Four elements: air, fire, water, and earth, and all of them repelling and attracting each other, of course, all integrated into God.
Except it's in Latin.
Oh, yeah, anyway, but besides that, okay. In terms of just maybe a couple more slides, and I can sort of move forward. Put it back one more. Atomics, as far as the early modern periods go, the geometric solids that explain what atomic matter looks like at that level. And before we think that, oh, how quaint, here we have two very quick illustrations of how Kepler, who we consider a early modern astronomer, integrated those geometric solids into his vision of the cosmos. You see the same thing in terms of Galileo. This is what marks a big turning point. The title page for the Sidereus Nuncius, his famous, groundbreaking treatise where, and if you sort of go through this in English, the starry messenger is very revealing in terms of how we make the change from experimental into experimental philosophy. The sidereal messenger unfolding the great and wonderful sights, the things that were observed by Galileo Galilei, with the help of a spyglass lately devised by him about the face of the moon, countless big stars, the Milky Way nebulous stars, especially about the 4 planets flying around the star Jupiter at unequal intervals and periods with wonderful swiftness and unknown by anyone until this day. And that got him into big trouble later on. Galileo's work definitely needs to be contextualized within the whole idea of discovery. Galileo points his spyglass into the heavens and discovers new worlds. Columbus had sailed out and had discovered new worlds as well. And the impact of this kind of thing is really sort of stunning. If you could give just a couple more quick slides here. And then, here's the title page for the discovery of the world and the moon, where you have Galileo, Kepler, and Copernicus all sort of conversing about what this all means. We have a title page from Fontenelle's Conversations on the Plurality of the Worlds. Here, a gentleman astronomer converses with a young lady, explaining to her the mystery of the cosmos. Margaret Cavendish fits into this universe. Her text, the description of the New World called The Blazing World, was published in 1666. Margaret Cavendish is famous in literary history, not so much for her work, but for the fact that she was the only woman in the 17th century invited to attend a meeting of the Royal Society. She was not invited for her natural philosophy. She was invited mostly because she was a sensation and because she could be a potential patron. But she was an aspiring scientist and writer, and unfortunately, like most women of her era, she lacked formal education. She was sort of left to her own autodidactic devices, and one of the products of this is her text, The Description of a New World, called The Blazing World. Almost out of time? Keep going? No? Stop. Okay. Anyway, the discovery of the Blazing World, she publishes this text in conjunction with a scientific treatise entitled Observations Upon Experimental Philosophy. So in her actual text, the actual volume that she publishes, it is you have 2 adjoining worlds, which mirrors what we actually see happening in the text. Next slide, real quick. Columbus with his new worlds, the Duchess of Newcastle's husband writing her a little complimentary poem, basically saying, honey, Columbus did a great job doing what he did, finding a new world which was just hidden from our sight. You, my love, have created a world out of your own imagination, and good job. So, anyway, the Blazing World I can give you a very quick plot synopsis. You have an unnamed young lady who is kidnapped at sea by a lusty merchant from her home world and transported into this new world, this blazing world. It's a sea kidnapping and a sea voyage. The ship heads up toward the North Pole. The men perish. She survives. She crosses into the blazing world at the adjacent poles. There she is transported by a series of theriomorphic beasts, and you can see some of these: bearmen, birdmen, flymen, wormmen, fishmen, ape-men, satyrs, foxmen, spider-men, licemen, jackdaw men, magpie men, and parrot men, with all of their particular fields of expertise. Once she arrives at the Golden City, which is the capital of the Blazing World, she meets the Emperor. He falls in love with her, he marries her, he makes her the Empress, and then sets her loose. Our Empress, the heroine, devotes herself to the pursuit of science. She promotes scientific research, she invents a royal society, she initiates conferences, she interrogates existing knowledge. She gathers a group of masters into her presence to debate important scientific questions. And in doing so, Cavendish, through the Empress, is able to promote her own view of natural philosophy. The experimental philosophers sort of come into under some fire for her because she wants to know important questions about the nature of the sun and the stars, and the astronomers, the birdmen, really can't give her conclusive answers. So she asks the bearmen to bring in their telescopes to look and to really give her definitive answers in terms of what's going on. And they can't do it. They argue about everything, and because she is so frustrated, she pretty much dismisses them and threatens to break their telescopes because these telescopes aren't really giving her any kind of definitive truth. And this really reflects Cavendish's own lack of formal education, lack of understanding of the field of science, and really sort of leaves her to her own devices to speculate and to let her imagination run wild. Later in the narrative, the Empress forms a collaboration with a female character, and this is where Margaret Cavendish is able to insert herself as a fictional character into the narrative. Margaret Cavendish, the character, tells the Empress that the thing that she really wants to do is to be the princess and empress of her own world. And so the Empress summons what she calls the immaterial spirits to come and ask, is there any available world of all these multiple worlds that are out there? Is there any world that my friend Margaret Cavendish could be the empress of? And these spirits inform her that yes, there are numerous, nay, infinite worlds, yet none is without government or inhabitants. So given the difficulty of how troublesome it is to go and conquer a people and govern them and subdue them, etc., why not just imagine a world of your own and populate it with whatever and whoever you want? So the alter ego of Margaret Cavendish sets about creating this imaginative world. And in doing so, she sort of goes through all the possibilities of various world systems available to her. And this will be real quick. Next slide. The atomistic universe of Democritus with all the chaos, the Platonic system, next, Descartes, and Cavendish had met Descartes and Copernicus, the Cartesian vortices that Cavendish considers and rejects. And after all is said and done, Cavendish decides that she would settle on a world of her own invention, one composed of sensitive and rational self-moving matter, and that this new world of imagination, when it was created, appeared so curious and so full of variety, so well-ordered and wisely governed, that it cannot possibly be expressed by words. Margaret Cavendish, like a number of natural philosophers of her time, was really driving up a blind alley in terms of her science, but in her attempt to explore the worlds of science and in her attempt to engage on her own intellectual explorations, she, as we would think, deserves a place on the bridge between two cultures. So by taking these kinds of questions that we pose regarding Mars and carrying those back into earlier traditions and literatures, we can emphasize how the exploration of new worlds contributes to new patterns of thinking and to new methods for exploring both the world that we live in and what happens within the mind. As they say in the Renaissance, as above, so below, as above, so below, as on Mars, perhaps so on Earth. Anyway, thank you very much.
Why don't we take just two quick questions?
Yes.
In my observation, it's the two-culture divide is really more one-sided because people who are scientists and engineers, as I observe them, are much more acquainted with literature than people on the literary side are acquainted with science. And I wonder if you agree that the gap is really sort of lopsided.
Well, there's room for growth on both sides, I'll say. Snow's contention is that both sides do tend to have not a deep familiarity with ideas in on either side of the culture. I guess you could argue that since the traditional culture has been out there longer and assumes that at some level, Snow says that the traditional culture assumes that it is the only culture, it does tend to be more neglectful of what's going on in the sciences. Part of what's going on also in the sciences, since the traditional culture already wraps around much of popular culture, the media, etc. Those who are in the sciences are already at some level more familiar because they are living in that world too. A lot of folks, I guess you could make the argument that it is lopsided in that a lot of folks in the humanities have often thought, that's just specialist knowledge, I don't need to know it in the sciences. Okay, so it's a good point. Yeah. Yes?
What place do you think Joseph Campbell plays in this interplay between the two cultures? Because I find his work, like in this one, Inner Reaches of Outer Space, which I recommend to everyone, written on the occasion of the Apollo moon landing, provides a map between the two cultures. in the world of thought, metaphor, myth, and religion.
I'm familiar with Campbell's
Is that
work.
a paraphrase?
Yeah, to paraphrase the question, how do you think Joseph Campbell, that's not John W. Campbell, who's the founder of Amway, that's a whole other world, okay. Joseph Campbell, what role might he serve in bridging the two cultures? And the particular text that was referenced here is one in which he tries to do that. He's kind of controversial in some ways. One of the things that's kind of intriguing and bizarre about Campbell's work is it goes back to Jung, and Jung himself is fascinated with the origins of early modern science. Jung has this very large set of disquisitions on alchemy and the role of alchemy and the way in which we have misinterpreted what the role of alchemy was. And to that degree, I think that what Campbell and Jung are getting at can serve as a bridge. If you want to see how it's been applied in, for instance, literary theory, look at Northrop Frye's The Anatomy of Criticism. But Jung has run afoul of some folks because of the notion of the collective unconscious, which seems too metaphysical woo-woo for a lot of people. Okay. But it's still well worth your time. I highly recommend it.
And he's very popular in Hollywood.
Yeah, he's very popular in Hollywood, too. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.